this session is an opportunity to ask all your questions to our clinician, our generous clinician, Dr. Risciuto. Was that good? And I'm almost wondering if it would be more comfortable for, does anybody want to move up? Or, because we're not that big a group. Where would you be more comfortable? Would you prefer to sit at a table? Actually, come up here because we'll want you on camera. So either there or here, wherever you like. Okay. And this session is being recorded. So ask your questions, and believe me, if you have these questions, somebody else out there who's either online or is watching, who will be watching this recording, will be really happy that you asked it. And it's so rare to have this much time with a clinician, because we know I don't know about you, but our appointments are always too fast to get all our questions in. So, would anybody like to kick off with a question? Actually, I wanted to introduce Eve, because Eve Jedrzejewska, one of our board members, is going to moderate this Q&A. Come on up.
Okay, so maybe I'll get us kicked off while you guys think of your questions. And again, I'd encourage you to ask the questions. I've attended many of these conferences in the US, and it really is a lovely opportunity to get some insight, both from yourselves as you ask the questions, but also from our dedicated panelists that you may not get to do in a clinic setting. So Dr. Risciuto, and it's nice to see you. I don't know if you remember me. It's probably 3 years since Sarah and I graduated from Sick Kids. But one of the things that came up as a topic at our discussion was the whole concept of transition, and how do you prepare your child? Do you start early? Do you start a bit later? What has been sort of the best approach in your experience, and what does Sick Kids specifically do to support the transition to adult care?
Yeah, no, it's an important question for sure. I'll start by saying I think there's ways for us to improve upon it, to be honest. As I alluded to earlier, though, I think the concept of transition is a gradual one, and I think it's important to start, as the patient is gradually getting older, just to gradually transition them towards being more independent with their care. I guess it's useful to think about some of the differences on the adult side when we're thinking about what we need to accomplish during transition. So on the adult side, certainly the physician will be looking to the patient to answer questions and all of that. So the patient really needs to have a good understanding of their condition, of their medications, and all of that stuff. So we try to give increasing independence to the patient on the pediatric side as they're moving through their teenage years. There's also a little bit less direct support sometimes on the adult side in terms of availability of nursing staff. So at least at Sick Kids, we're quite spoiled. We have clinic nurses who are available to answer questions by phone or by email, and they act as this intermediate between the physician and the patient, and they're so incredibly useful. And there's less of that support on the adult side. It's usually, maybe the secretary of the physician that the patient would be reaching out to on the adult side. So as a consequence of that, the patient then I think has to maybe advocate for themselves a little bit more because they won't have that nurse to kind of do the in-between step. So I think increasing independence with the patient, maybe even eventually getting to a point where you do part of the visit with the patient alone and ask the parents to step out for a little bit. As I mentioned before, I think it really is nice if you can introduce the adult physician while the patient is still on the pediatric side. I think they do that very well on the liver side. I am an IBD physician by background, not a hepatologist. So for our patients at Sick Kids, it'll be myself and usually one of the hepatologists who's involved in the care. And so the pediatric hepatologist and either Dr. Hirschfield or Dr. Ghulam Hussain, who's another hepatologist at TGH, they'll have these transition visits that happen before the official transition. There are a lot of IBD physicians at Mount Sinai, which is the adult hospital that we usually transition people to for patients staying in Toronto. But one change we're trying to make is to centralize care. So we've identified one IBD physician on the adult side and kind of who has an interest in PSC, and now we're going to start sending all of our patients to that person. And I think that just helps to make things easier. And we're now trying to tie in the IBD piece to those transition visits that were already happening on the liver piece. So that avoids, firstly confusion, where you might not know who your provider is going to be on the adult side. If it can only be that one person, then you know from the get-go. And if you've met them before the official transition, I think that's really, really helpful. I think we haven't really used formal tools, but some do exist. And I think once this IBD trial is kind of finalized, and if those educational modules are found to be effective, that we should maybe start looking at those to transition them over for PSC as well. And then this concept of a navigator is also something that can be useful. So identifying somebody on the pediatric side, for us it would usually be like a nurse or a nurse practitioner who's kind of there to help guide the patient through that transition process and just be like a point of contact if they're having any difficulties. So it is sort of an at-risk period. I know there's a lot of research that's been done in the IBD space where that transition period is a time, for example, where people end up using the emergency room more often because they're not as plugged into stuff on the adult side. They're not sure where to go. So I think there's work to be done, but hopefully we're making improvements.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience or from Slido? I don't see anything from Slido. Oh.
Hi. Understanding that you're a GI and not a hepatologist, do you have any even a gut feeling of how long until transplant, what's typical of what you see? And also understanding that every case is different, but it was certainly a topic during our peer group that is a cause of concern, as we go to Google and see 10 years until transplant and think, are doing the math in our head of how old our kid will be, and then not being the reality. Is there any estimate that you have of what you're seeing in the pediatric world?
Yeah, no, obviously that's a super important question. I think the best we can do is kind of point to some of the larger studies on this topic, recognizing though that there are differences between studies. For example, I know we talk about selection bias, which means were the patients included in the study may be different than other patients with the condition. So for example, if you're looking at a study that involves patients followed at a transplant center, that's obviously different than patients followed in the community, and there's going to be a bias towards higher transplant rates. But on the pediatric side, as I mentioned, really the largest study we have to date is the Paediatric PSC Consortium. And in that study, at 5 years, it was about 10% of people who needed a transplant, and by 10 years, it was about 30%. One of the challenges in studying a pediatric condition is there's this artificial truncation that happens when people transfer to adult care. So you'll see all the pediatric studies tend to have an average follow-up period of 4 years, because then they move to a different center. It becomes difficult to continue following them. So that's a challenge. One way to try to get around that, which we're working on, is something called health administrative data, which is essentially data that results automatically from contacts with healthcare, from billing and things like that. And that crosses that divide between pediatric and adult. It just continues uninterrupted. So we're hoping to link our pediatric patients to health administrative data to see what's happening to them after transition. In the adult world, you'll hear figures like median time to transplant is about 15 years. That means about half of patients will have a transplant by about 15 years. I will say that increasingly we are picking up PSC at a milder and milder stage. So I think that number, if we were to look at it for more recent times, would be even longer. We are we act so quickly now if we see a raised liver enzyme in a patient with IBD. We're so fast to get an MRCP that I do think we're picking up disease that has a different natural history sometimes than what's been described in the more traditional studies. And so I always say, I think it's quite telling to see what the evolution is over the first couple of years to kind of get a sense as to whether things are progressing rapidly, slowly, not at all. Like we even pick up sometimes changes of, very subtle, non-specific, and just nothing happens over time. So those are some numbers to hang your hat on, but again, I think we are picking up milder and milder disease.
Okay, I'm just going to follow up on Lori's question. If I remember correctly, in October when we had the PSC day here, it had been mentioned, I believe, that there was some question as to whether or not PSC in pediatrics as opposed to PSC in adults may or may not be the exact same thing. And then I believe this morning you mentioned that sometimes you see higher inflammation in children. Is the statistics for transplantation for pediatrics similar to adults? Like if you were to be diagnosed as an adult, is it likely that you would go longer or shorter? Like, I guess.
Yeah, another great question. And that's where it's a little bit difficult to address based on the fact that most studies of people who have pediatric onset disease tend to stop after 4 or so years. So I think it's unclear. When we looked at our cohort, and we looked at the initial part of, like we can generate these curves where you look to time to liver transplant. So the pediatric curve kind of ended after 5 years, and the adult curve went on. When we looked at this kind of preliminarily, the initial curve seemed pretty comparable, suggesting that maybe rates of progression are similar. But I think we need definitely more research to definitively answer that question if the rate of progression is different in pediatrics. I do still have this feeling that we pick up potentially milder disease in our pediatric patients, not necessarily because the disease is different. I don't think there's anything inherently different between a child or an adult being diagnosed with PSC in terms of the underlying pathophysiological processes, but I do think we're more attentive in pediatrics to things like abnormal liver enzymes, and so I do think we step in and do that MRCP earlier. So I think it is possible that we'll find slower progression in the pediatric onset patients because we're picking up milder disease. If you were to kind of adjust for severity at time of diagnosis, I would expect it's pretty similar. I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else, but maybe it'll come back to me.
So maybe I'll ask another question as our audience thinks. We did talk about, and sort of building on what you've said, the progression of disease from childhood to adulthood, and many of our kids getting double diagnosed with AIH. What's the recent or the most recent view on AIH and whether it's an autoimmune sclerosing continuum or is it a different disease? Has there been more research in that space? And again, some of us have children that are obviously on heavy doses of prednisone, and how does that sort of go forward as they become older?
Yeah, no, it's a great topic and one that I think both myself and Dr. Hirschfield are really interested in. We'd recently put together like a bit of a commentary article on this topic. So I think you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. The initial traditional sort of teaching around this was that PSC with AIH was a different disease. I think increasingly, at least for myself and Dr. Hirschfield, our perspective is it's probably exists along a spectrum, but it's all PSC, but it can present in a more inflammatory fashion sometimes, and that seems to happen more often in pediatrics. I think sometimes I compare it to Crohn's disease, and certainly Crohn's disease can be inflammatory at one time and then fibrotic at another time. So I think it's possible for a condition like PSC to be similar, to be inflammatory at one time and fibrotic at another time. So I think there's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum, which happens to coincide with younger age, it's more inflammatory, but that over time, that inflammation tends to subside, and you're sort of left with a fibrotic piece, which is more similar to what we see in adult onset PSC. Of course, the question is then, is there a role for treating patients who have PSC with features of AIH with immunosuppression? And it is definitely still something that we do. there's not clear-cut evidence that that changes long-term outcomes. When we look at things like transplant rate in patients who have PSC versus PSC with AIH features, it seems to be pretty comparable. But we don't have good evidence to tell us that treating is not associated with benefit. Like, we don't have strong evidence one way or the other. So until things sort of become clearer, I think we should continue treating, and given the possibility that it's helpful. It hasn't yet been definitively shown. But I think it's good to sort of approach PSC with AIH overlap a little bit differently than we approach traditional AIH. So in a patient who has AIH, really it's a commitment to very long-term, if not lifelong, immunosuppression. You're targeting normalization of liver enzymes, normalization of inflammation on liver biopsy. I think if we hold PSC AIH to that same standard, it may result in overtreating with immunosuppression, because we know that the liver enzymes often don't normalize in PSC. And so if we're kind of escalating the immune suppression to that end goal, it may be one that's not realistic and not appropriate. And I think there should also be a little bit more of an openness to potentially withdrawing that immune suppression and considering that the disease can evolve over time. And that's sometimes where a liver biopsy can be helpful. If you have a patient initially with PSC AIH who's on treatment, and like immunosuppressive treatment, and you find liver enzymes are kind of stuck high, to help guide the question, is this just the PSC driving the liver enzymes, or is there an AIH piece which would require or suggest escalating treatment? A liver biopsy can be informative to demonstrate if there's ongoing inflammation or not. So it's a big unknown, but I think my take on it is just to view it a little bit differently than pure AIH and have a bit more of an openness to potentially considering trials off immune suppression.
Great, thank you. And I think we had a question over there.
My question is about transplantation, I guess. Are there any prospects for kind of an intermediate procedure where because we heard about how regenerative the liver is. Are there prospects for finding those regions that have high amounts of degeneration, as we saw in Dr. McParland's slides, and maybe just removing portions so that the liver regenerates, or is that a dumb question?
Yeah, I mean, you're really catching me now outside of my area of expertise. I can say there's definitely nothing imminently in the works along those lines, but I think, that's something that's probably being explored and maybe coming down the pipeline, but not sort of anytime soon, I would say. But a very good question, and potentially eventually.
So we do have a question from Slido as well, which asks whether it's possible that a child can be born with PSC as opposed to develop PSC.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think about these conditions of PSC and IBD as acquired conditions, meaning that, they're not present at time of birth, but they're definitely, people are born with a susceptibility to it. So we know that genetics play a role, not a huge role. Genetics play a much smaller role than environment in PSC, but it is usually something that develops at some period afterwards, and time of onset is hugely variable. Most common age of presentation is in sort of adults around the age of 40. In our pediatric cohort, I would say it's usually in teenagers, but we do have some patients as young as 3 or 4 years old. But it's generally thought of as a multifactorial disease. You have this genetic predisposition in you that has a lot to do with genes related to your immune system, like HLA variants, and then right combination of things in your environment and everything together kind of collides to lead to the initiation of disease. And I'll say also that, there's probably some exceptions to that in the sense that similarly to IBD, if you have somebody with disease of onset of disease at a really young age and sort of a really severe unusual phenotype, you can have cases that are what we call monogenic, which means that there may be one specific gene that's causing the disease. That hasn't been shown very much in PSC, more of a demonstrated phenomenon in IBD, but there are those exceptions, unusual, very early onset cases where genes play a much stronger role, but sort of bread and butter PSC genetics play a smaller role than environmental factors.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? So maybe I'll throw in another question and then you guys can come up with some other ones. So I did find it interesting when Dr. Hirschfield was speaking today about PSC and IBD really being one disease and presenting in two different organs. So maybe you can provide comments on research into microbiome, how important it is to control colitis if there is existing PSC. Maybe some comments on microscopic colitis. I know as our children go through different colonoscopies, there is differing views how hard you go at microscopic colitis. So a little bit on that area, which is in your sphere of expertise.
For sure. So we definitely, I think there's still a little bit of controversy, but I think most people would say that we believe that PSC IBD is one disease that manifests in two places and driven by the same underlying processes. And the reason, I think there's growing support for that, and I kind of went through that a little bit. There's distinct genetics, distinct microbiome, distinct phenotype, and all of those things. But in terms of the relationship between the gut and the liver, we do believe that a healthy gut can help to promote a healthy liver. As I said earlier also, there's not really a high quality study that we can point to support that, but I think it has a lot to do with how difficult it is to study that as a question. And then as I also mentioned, the relationship between colectomy and PSC recurrence, like obviously there's something happening there between the gut and the liver. If taking the colon away decreases your chance of recurrence. So in regular IBD not associated with PSC, we have this concept of treat to target, which means we have these cycles where we treat people, we reassess, and if we're not at our target, we change something about the treatment. And back in the day, our target used to be making people feel better, no symptoms. But increasingly, our target is getting deeper and deeper. And at the very least, mucosal healing, which means doing a colonoscopy and seeing that the tissue looks normal. So that's also very much our goal in PSC IBD. From an IBD perspective, that has been associated with a decreased risk of having flare-ups in the future. It may be protective for the liver. And as I mentioned, it helps to protect against the risk for colon cancer. So that's definitely the goal. So I believe in this concept of treat to target in PSC IBD as well, and frequently reassessing and making changes if you're not getting to your target. How deep to go, I think, is an interesting question, especially in PSC IBD. I would say for most IBD, we're usually pretty satisfied if we see a normal mucosa. If there are some microscopic changes on biopsies, usually we wouldn't change treatment specifically for that. But I think that's a bit of an unknown in PSC IBD. We don't know exactly what's driving the increased risk of colon cancer in PSC IBD. Does ongoing, even microscopic inflammation play a role? Potentially. So I would say if there's sort of an easy way or a path to trying to address that microscopic inflammation to try to target even healing at a microscopic level, then I think it's a reasonable thing to do. But it's not always as simple as that, because when it comes to IBD therapies, if you're doing well on one treatment, it's kind of a roll of the dice whether the next thing is going to work. So it's always a decision about, do we risk giving up the progress we've made on this treatment to try to do a little bit better on the next one, when in fact it might not do as well. So that's a discussion to be had between patient and physician. But I think the healthier the bowel, the better. And on the topic of microbiome, there is some research being done on fecal transplant for PSC IBD. It's still, in the realm of experimental. It's not mainstream and an available treatment at present, but that may be something that's coming down the pipeline potentially.
That's great, thank you.
Another kind of follow-up. If you're thinking that PSC and the associated IBD is the same, is there any other organs or areas in the body in which inflammation would be possible from the PSC?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not really that I've come across, but what that question is making me think of a little bit is other kind of parallel conditions, which sometimes I think are kind of comparable, specifically the gut joint axis. So we do have patients with IBD who can have arthritis. And it's also thought that maybe there's something about, leaky gut and things leaking out and triggering inflammation in the joints. And interestingly, there's a little bit of literature about the type of IBD in patients with arthritis also being predominantly colonic and more right colon. So it's just an interesting observation, like, is there something happening in that right colon that leads to triggering or like leaking of things to trigger inflammation elsewhere in the body? But PSC is known to be associated with an increased risk of other autoimmune conditions like thyroid and so on. But in terms of just kind of PSC IBD, we don't typically see inflammation elsewhere. Not that's been described so far anyways.
Okay, so we have a question that is maybe a follow-up on the question that we just had in terms of whether increased susceptibility to autoimmune diseases impact your approach to diagnosis, treatment, and long-term management of some of these patients.
I mean, at present, it's not really recommended to go screening for other conditions because the rate is not necessarily high enough to be worth it. But I would say just having an increased index of suspicion. So if you do, if something's not seeming quite right or there's weird symptoms that can't quite be explained, just bear in mind that there is this coexistence with other autoimmune conditions. And, just the importance of multidisciplinary care if you have multiple conditions involved, and trying to make sure that all of the different members of the team and physicians are all kind of on the same page and taking care of the patient jointly. That's something we try to do at Sick Kids for the liver and the gut with joint clinic visits as much as possible. Difficult to do if it's someone outside GI, but just at least making sure there's good communication so everybody's on the same page.
Great, thank you. And another question, and this was something that came up in our peer groups as well, is mental health of the patients. So is there anything special that you do during visits to assess mental health? Are there supports that the hospital offers as part of the sort of multidisciplinary approach to healthcare?
Yeah, so Sarah has a whole session on mental health right after this, so she'll be better positioned to answer. But I think the resources really depend on each center. I think we're quite fortunate at Sick Kids that we have access to people like Sarah, who's a health psychologist with an interest in IBD as well as PSC. We also have a psychiatrist who we have meetings with every 2 weeks. So certainly, if we identify that concerns around whatever it might be, mood or adjusting to a difficult new chronic disease diagnosis, we're quick to engage those people. Sarah runs like peer support groups that can be done virtually. And then, of course, always encourage people if they have resources available through their community or maybe their pediatrician or family doctor. But obviously, it's a very important part of the puzzle. But it is quite sort of institution dependent. And Sarah will be able to talk about that a lot more in the next session.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, and I do wonder whether the teens are asking this question in their own session, and it's related to consumption of alcohol and what your recommendations are, and whether, I know that in the US, especially for people that are on a transplant, are much more strict than they are in Canada in terms of abstaining. So maybe if you can comment.
Yeah, I mean, just general advice around alcohol with any liver disease. Obviously, not drinking any alcohol is great, but, we try to be realistic with our recommendations. And so the two types of alcohol drinking that can be particularly harmful to the liver are binge drinking, so we recommend avoiding that at all costs, and then also just like regular consumption of quite significant amount on a regular basis, but sort of a little bit socially here and there, recognizing that trying to be realistic again would be the least sort of harmful version of alcohol intake in the context of a chronic liver disease. And then I've worked with, a lot of you may know Dr. Kamath at Sick Kids, who is a hepatologist that I've worked with, who very sadly just moved to go work at CHOP in Philadelphia. But anyways, part of her spiel is always, if you're going to do something, probably the thing that's least harmful is actually marijuana compared to alcohol or other drugs. Just again, being realistic. And then otherwise, along the lines of doing things to help keep your liver healthy, it's not just about, things like alcohol, but also trying to maintain like a healthy weight, because fatty liver disease is also something that can significantly affect the liver. So we want to make sure we're not in a situation where there's significant second hits to the liver. And then healthy diet, things rich in antioxidants, those are all things that are helpful as well.
Great, thank you. And we have a question on screening siblings or half-sibling for PSC if the disease runs in the family.
Yeah, not something that we do. I mean, there is an increased risk in siblings, but it's still very rare. So it doesn't warrant testing for it. But again, of course, if there's any worrisome symptoms, low index of suspicion or low threshold for initiating investigations to look for it. But like, as I mentioned, genetics play a much smaller role than environment.
Any other questions in the room? Mary?
I have a very non-scientific question. So a parlor game that many PSCers and parents play is to look back right before diagnosis and think, what was that triggering event? And I'm curious because you probably see a lot of PSC patients while they're being explored for PSC, because often it's the IBD symptoms that are the first symptoms. Yeah. What do you hear from the parents? Do they come in and say, oh my gosh, this just happened, or this was the thing that most recently happened? That I'm just curious if you want to join our game.
I mean, I think I can answer that a little bit more for the IBD side of things. Again, like this is never something that anybody has done, eaten, or it's much more complex than that. So it's nobody is ever to blame for this. But one story that we sometimes hear is travel to somewhere else, and people kind of catch a bug and things just never kind of settle after that. And that's not to say that the bug that was caught while traveling is the cause, but it may have just kind of kicked something off or led to unearthing something that was already there, really. Yeah, that's probably the main one, I would say.
Great, thank you. A question related to diet. So there is one here specifically on whether sugars or artificial sweeteners are potentially more harmful to the liver. But I know you started commenting on potential diet impacts, whether there's any specific diets that we should consider for our children and what's more beneficial versus not.
Yeah, I mean, again, so we don't have a silver bullet when it comes to diet, so it's really general recommendations that we work. What I usually tell my patients is that if you're looking for a diet to emulate, think like Mediterranean style diet, lots of whole foods, which means when you're eating something, you can look at it and recognize what it is, as opposed to like something out of a box, lots of fresh veggies and fruits, and again, like not too much red meat, dairy, lots of lean protein, plant-based protein, very important too. So those are our general recommendations around diet, and that's the advice we give for IBD or PSC, and really it's helpful for any chronic disease. There's no specific diet really beyond that that's been shown to be effective for PSC. There is some evidence around certain types of IBD, more so Crohn's disease, where some quite rigid diets have been shown to be helpful. But in the setting of PSC IBD, I would make those general recommendations. In terms of this specific question, I mean, certainly a high intake of sugar can contribute to fatty liver disease. Even sometimes like too much fruit consumption can lead to that, so we would recommend not too much sugar. And then artificial sweeteners kind of, I guess, fit into the category of like processed foods, or so probably neither of them is great. Yeah.
Thank you. Jess?
So this is related to Mary's earlier question about, and then your answer that it's usually environment and that if you've been traveling. So when you say traveling, is it more so like a change of environment rather than like, because when I think traveling and a doctor might have said like traveling or whatever, I think of like another country. But if I look at myself and my background or whatever, like I moved to BC for school, and that was right before my diagnosis. So could it have just been the change of environment potentially when you talk about traveling or going to a different place?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make too much of this point, like I don't think that travel is causative in any way. I think it maybe just leads to it being picked up. I'm not sure, if there's, I think maybe the more dramatic the shift in your environment and the things you're exposed to. But yeah, no, the sort of instances I was thinking of is like patients who, travel to other countries and get like traveler's diarrhea, and then things never really settle, and it kind of leads to things being picked up. But I definitely don't think that, travel is causally involved.
And we have a follow-up question on diet in relation to the use of prebiotics and probiotics in diets for PSCers and for IBD.
Yeah, again, the answers are not very satisfying, not a silver bullet again, so for either. So prebiotics or probiotics have not yet been definitively shown to be beneficial really for either condition. Maybe a little bit more evidence around ulcerative colitis or patients post-colectomy who have a condition that we call pouchitis, where the pouch that's made after a colectomy can get inflamed. Probiotics can be helpful there, but otherwise, have not been shown to change the disease course at all. I always say if something is not harmful and people are interested in trying it, then by all means we can give it a try. But I would view it more as an adjunct and not sort of the primary treatment for the IBD. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that a lot of patients and everybody really can have irritable bowel syndrome along with things like IBD. So irritable bowel syndrome is a situation where your bowel's not inflamed, but you do have symptoms maybe of belly pain, constipation, diarrhea, and probiotics can be useful there. So sometimes we'll use them in that context of helping to address the symptoms more so than underlying inflammation.
Along the same lines, what are your thoughts on supplementation? So we often hear vitamin D, calcium is important for bone health, but I can say from our experience, because it's not prescribed, we're never quite sure if it's like how important it is that we're following those recommendations.
Right. Again, no slam dunks, but we do feel quite strongly about vitamin D. It's just good for you for so many reasons, and most people in Canada are deficient, especially in the winter months. And it does seem to have some benefit when it comes to immune function. So we recommend it for all of our patients with IBD and PSC, and we do regularly check levels and recommend adjusting doses until we get to the target level. So that's really the one we feel most strongly about. The next one down, I would say, is calcium, just simply because, not so much related to the disease process, but more because most teenagers and kids in Canada don't get enough calcium. And those are really the two main ones that we recommend. If people want to supplement with a multivitamin, that's obviously not a problem, but those would sort of be the main two.
Any other questions? I think we're good, Mary.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap it up and wait for our swap of speakers. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys. I hope you had fun with your first group. And this afternoon, we have Sarah Ahola Cahoot. And Dr. Cahoot is a psychologist and health clinician scientist with the Medical Psychiatry Alliance at the Hospital for Sick Children, Sick Kids, and she's an assistant professor with the University of Toronto. Dr. Cahoot's program of research develops therapies and programs to support the quality of life of children with chronic health conditions and their families. These therapies focus on supporting the physical, emotional, and social health of these children. To date, Dr. Cahoot's research has focused on online peer mentoring, peer-to-peer program, and mindfulness and acceptance-based therapies. Can I come? Yes. Dr. Cahoot also promotes research in children with chronic physical and mental illness within the MPA. Thank you.
Okay, this is the button I pressed for the slides, right? Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. I really am a health psychologist at heart, and I think one of the things that I really love about my work is I get to kind of see how resilient these young people are. And I thought to myself, okay, I get a little bit of your time, and what would be the most useful? So I was actually thinking about walking through emotional coaching for young people who are living with PSC. Oh, which one is it? Okay. Most of the time, I like to really start off talks by reminding everybody that our brains are wired to survive. And the reason I bring that up is because happiness is not our default state. So if we're not happy all the time, it's not because we're doing something wrong. It's because safety is the default state, right? And ultimately, all of our threat systems are going to be activated when someone we love is sick. And on top of that, then when we get stressed out, what ends up happening is that we get really judgmental. If we go back to that fight or flight response, or there's a bear running after us, our brains start making really snap judgments, because it's the idea of, am I going to run left or right? Because one might mean that I escape and one might mean that I get attacked by the bear. So it's very common when we're under stress to actually get super judgmental, and that's where we can trip up and make mistakes, and sometimes lean into that negativity bias and think of all those worst case scenarios. Also, when we're stressed out and anxious, really, our brains go to the least solvable problem. And then it makes us feel good to try to think about all these problems, solve all these solutions out of it, which can ultimately make us feel worse. I think PSC is unique in many ways. If we think of this idea that our brains don't like uncertainty, I think we all would love to know what's going to happen next. Most people walking about the world who are otherwise healthy get to pretend that they know. And I can also say that everyone in this room knows that the minute you're diagnosed with a chronic disease like PSC, that is gone. You don't know. And for these young people, it's what's going to happen next in terms of disease progression. It might be this really annoying thing that happens to teenagers where they really want to get away from you. But I'll tell you right now, I'm in my 40s, and when I'm not feeling well, I still call my parents. So it's that awkward, like, oh, I don't feel well, I want my parents close, but really I want to get away from them and be with my friends. That is a really frustrating space to be in for young people. It could also be really difficult for you as parents and caregivers to figure out, when do you lean in and save them or support them or help them, and when do you kind of back off and let them make mistakes while they still live with you so that you're there to help catch them. I also think oftentimes something that gets lost is the idea that there's grief. Folks think about grief more often when they lose someone, but there's a lot of like ambiguous loss when living with chronic disease. And at the end of the day, this is all sort of an inevitable part of life. And this might sound really pessimistic, but there's a lot to work with there, because these young people learn very early on that they're going to create the lives that they want for themselves. And that can be really, really helpful. So as a health psychologist, I actually get to hear everything your teenagers and your young people say about you and what they want. And one of the things that I love telling caregivers and parents is that they actually do want to talk to you. And they want to give you all the details. The problem is, and the only stumbling block on why they don't do that, is because you keep trying to fix it. Really and truly, your teenagers just want to sort of dump on you and have you just sit there and be like, wow, that's really hard. I've gotten into a habit of, even with my own kids, sometimes when they come to me, I will outright ask them, because I don't even know the answer. I'll be like, do you want to be hugged? Do you want to be heard? Or do you want to be helped? I'll tell you right now, I can think of maybe once that they've ever said helped. Because really what they want is they want to just talk at me and have me hold them. I like to think of it this way. This analogy I actually got from a young person. I thought it was really beautiful. They were kind of like, this is what it feels like for me. It feels like I am trying to learn how to swim. And my parents are on the dock and they're trying to kind of yell at me over the waves to try to teach me how to swim and tell me what to do. I just want them to get wet. So what they really want is they want you to just jump in there with them and just recognize that it's really hard. This might sound really simple and straightforward, but it is not easy, especially when your kids come to you and their problems, in many ways, in your view, are really easy fixes. But that's just not what they want to hear in that moment. What they want to hear is, wow, that's really overwhelming. Oh, that sounds really hard. Oh, that's tricky to try to figure out. And even if you get to the point where you do want to ask them, hey, like, do you want help problem solving it? The hardest part is if they say no, don't do it. So I wanted to bring up emotional coaching. It's a large topic, but I think we can get through some of the basics today just in the time that we have, because it's a 5-step approach. And there's lots of books in education, but I really wanted to kind of distill it for everyone now, just so that you can play around with it. This doesn't have to always go in this order. It's more, think about what would be workable for you to integrate into your life. First and foremost, step 1. Become aware of your child's emotions, and doing this in whatever way you're able to stay calm yourself. It's very common for a lot of the young folks where if suddenly they've noticed that their parents are starting to get anxious, that makes them more anxious. Or if suddenly their parents tell them, oh, no, it's okay, everything's okay. I don't know that when things are fine and things are good, anyone ever comes over to you randomly to just be like, hey, you know what? Things are okay right now. For many young people, that is a symbol that it's not okay. I also think there's a part of it where I'm not trying to ask people to lie or not to let them know you're scared or you're anxious. It's more about being honest and knowing that together you can tackle it. Another invitation around becoming aware of your child's emotions is really thinking about what's the function of that emotion. If they're really clingy or they're arguing with you, is it actually their way of trying to draw you in? Right? Like, what is the point of the things that they're doing? Often there is some type of reassurance they're seeking, or they're trying to bring you close, but doing it in a way that's kind of like cooler than asking your mom and dad for help. So really taking a moment and pausing and thinking, okay, where could this be coming from? Step 2 is ultimately, much like in real estate, it's relationship. Anytime there are emotions that are difficult for young people, that is an opportunity for you to connect, an opportunity for you to be that person who just listens and says, yeah, I know this is hard. I've been there too, or I know what it's like to be really angry. And to remind ourselves that when our kids are angry, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily disobeying us or challenging our authority. Anger often is the easiest emotion to display. If our kids are scared, it doesn't mean that we're not doing our job or that we somehow messed up or forgot anything. It's just, kids are just scared sometimes. And sadness isn't something that needs to always be distracted or to be fixed. Teaching these young people that it's okay to have feelings, like feelings are not right or wrong or good or bad. Certainly what you do with them can get you into trouble, but learning that feelings are okay is a superpower. Working in GI, I often say just it's better out than in, and I think that's the case for most things. It's just better out than in, and I say that because adding a little bit of a humor to it when talking about feelings, which is usually pretty awkward, can help young people. And we know from clinical work and in research that being able to actually acknowledge an emotion will inherently soothe that emotion in that moment, and it will decrease in intensity. You'll notice all these steps are kind of blending into each other. And as I said, it doesn't have to go in this order. It's sort of this idea of what's workable for you. Listening and validating your child's experience does not mean that you agree with them. It doesn't mean that you're condoning anything they're saying, or I think it's just that moment of just genuinely listening to understand instead of listening to respond. Holding on to that can often be really helpful when doing this type of listening. And if you're at a point where you're like, I have no idea what I'm gonna say and I don't know how to respond, genuinely to just repeat back what they said. If you get it wrong, I think we all know this, our kids will tell us very, very quickly to our faces that we got it wrong. So even if you're not sure and you wanna take a guess, even saying, oh, I'm not sure, like, do you mean da 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 da? I also think it can be really helpful in those moments, as I said, to just help your young people decipher, what is this feeling? Most young people really struggle with this. They might be able to say sad, mad, scared, but getting into like, oh, that's so deep, that's so disappointing. Or, you know what, that sounds like I'd feel pretty jealous in that moment, or I might be frustrated. So adding those words in, it'll start engaging your child, the thinking part of their brain, instead of that more overwhelming feeling part. And when you can get that on board, it can really help. And just to really reiterate that, like, feelings are not right or wrong or good or bad. Everyone has a whole host of feelings. Feelings rarely even come on their own. They usually come with a buddy or a friend, right? And getting a little curious about what is it. And finally at 5, which is often the step that I think a lot of people start with, especially I can say myself with my kids, sometimes if I'm really frustrated, I'll jump real quick to step 5. It's also knowing that setting limits is important. So yeah, feelings are never right or wrong. What you do with them can certainly get you into trouble, and there are certain behaviors that are not okay. And over in this context of living with a medical condition, know that these boundaries, as much as your kids and teenagers don't like them, when there are no boundaries and no rules, that is really dysregulating and scary. Because if all the rules fall away, then I must be really sick, or something must really be wrong with me if suddenly I'm allowed to do whatever I want, stay up as late as I want, and whatever. So having some of those rules and can have that consistency actually does help ground them. I also think in situations where inevitably you have to have that conversation with your children around kind of something that they're doing that's not okay, just kind of asking them, like, what is it that you're hoping for? What is it, getting back to that first step where you're thinking about the function of a behavior, kind of asking them and see if they have an answer, right? If you ask them and they don't know, they're gonna be more willing to hear you out on your thoughts. Oftentimes though, especially when we're thinking about situations where there is no answer, there's no fix, genuinely sitting and taking the time to listen and connect is often enough. Listening and sitting with them and acknowledging their feelings and their frustrations is enough. So in service of time, I won't kind of say too much more, but really and truly, just to kind of have this all on the same slide, it's that idea of, like, first becoming aware of what's going on, what feelings are coming up for your child, and where might they be coming from. Step 2, noticing that this is an opportunity for you to connect. 3 is really and truly listening. You don't have to agree with them, you just have to listen and acknowledge those feelings. Help them find the right words for those feelings, and then if they want to, you can problem solve. And if they don't want to, the hardest ask there is to back off. I think this comes up, and I know that oftentimes with the young people that I get to work with who have PSC, and I heard it even come up earlier, where it's that conversation of what do you do when they're tired and they have fatigue and they don't want to do things, and you're like, is this one of those situations where we let them stay home, or do we force them to go, right? And I think coming at it from this perspective, I wonder if in those situations, and granted this is probably in the morning when things are really busy and stressful and hectic, seeing if you can take kind of 30 seconds, a minute to just connect with what else is going on for them in that moment, just how are they feeling? because that might give you a bit of a clue on when to push versus when to fall back a bit. So again, happy to answer any questions. I wanted to make sure I left enough room for questions, but some things to just consider for yourselves. This can just be a reflective process, sort of thinking back to situations you've been in, or even moving forward when you leave today, thinking about what might be underlying some of those feelings that you see out of your kids. What are you already doing that might fall into this idea of emotion coaching? I have no doubt that you are all using aspects of this already. I didn't expect to come here and teach you something new. It's more about how can we level up what you're already doing to be a little bit more helpful for kids. And maybe there was something I said that was new, right? One of the things I will say that without breaking confidentiality, one of the things that I brought up upstairs was this idea of the shoulds. All of us feel like we should be keeping up with this, or we should be doing this, we should be going here, we should be doing that. And what I said to everyone upstairs, I'm like, you need to stop shoulding all over yourself. I think what we need to do is think about, in those moments where we feel like we should, ask yourself, do I have to? Do I want to? And if the answer to do I have to and do I want to is no, then maybe we want to consider letting go of some of those shoulds. So maybe I will leave it at that. Thank you everyone for listening, and happy to answer any and all questions, whether they are about caregiving or about working with the young kiddos.
So this maybe isn't necessarily for pediatric patient, but one of the things we heard from our young adults at the conference is, please stop asking us how we are.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah.
do you have any suggestions for how
Yes.
to connect with them if we can't ask them how they are, or if we
Yeah.
want to respect that request?
Yeah, so I will say I 1000% agree. Trust that your kids will tell you if they feel tired or in pain or like garbage. So the more that you ask, how are you doing? How are you feeling? You're putting that focus back on all the stuff that they don't want to be thinking about. So oftentimes what will happen is I will recommend, if it's a situation where a parent is or caregiver is in a space where they can literally just stop asking. Literally just stop asking. Period, and stop. If the idea of not asking at all is too upsetting, then picking a time during the day that is a consistent time where it's like, hey, our check-in for the day is gonna be after school at 6 o'clock. I recommend not making that time in the morning or right before bed, but sometime where it's like, you know that this is gonna be the check-in time. Another wonderful example that I cannot take credit for, but I think is an amazing way to do this as well, is having kind of a thermometer or a 0 to 10 on the fridge, and then every day they can just put on the fridge where they at, where it's like, whether you want to make it 10 out of 10 is great and I feel awesome, and 0 feels like I'm having a very bad day, and just having them daily mark it down on there so nothing has to be said. I think oftentimes, again, it's more about where do you want to focus. These are young people who are involved in the medical system quite a bit, right? So by definition, everything's about what's wrong and how do we fix it. The invitation here is to help them learn to recognize what's going right and what are those things that they're doing already that are awesome. And in moments that are really tough and really bad, getting into that space of and both, where it can be a bad day and also you can do something for yourself to care for yourself. These young people need to learn to live in the gray. We want to kind of avoid in whatever way we can, this idea of black and white and all good, all bad. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Actually, then I'll ask a question. Of you all, how many of you have heard of a 504 plan?
Or an IEP for the Canadians. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more?
I can share a little bit. So that is whether your child is in elementary school, high school, and this also is for college and universities. You can, they do qualify for accommodations, right? So some of those accommodations might be things like being able to write exams in a quiet space on their own, or having a bit of extra time on exams, or it could be having some flexibility on due dates depending on where their disease is at the time. And this, again, extends not just for elementary and secondary school, it's also for college and university. And I believe also when they get to that space where they are driving, they can also get parking spaces that are a little bit closer to their classrooms to make it more accessible. But those are also things that you can talk to student services about, or in guidance departments when you're in those other grades.
There's also you mentioned bathroom accommodation.
Yeah, for those who also have Crohn's or colitis, you can also get accommodations for things like asking for a residence that has a private bathroom, or having your own bedroom so you don't have to share with somebody else. Yeah.
Any thoughts on your part? Questions? I have another one.
Okay.
Can I do another one? Is that okay?
I don't think it's breaking the rules. I think it's okay.
When you mentioned, I can't remember if you used the term grief. I think that is something that a lot of people, and I'll admit, I mean, I was in a field where I talked to grieving and grief all the time. But it took a while for me to realize how I felt that way when my son got sick. It was like, oh. And it can be really hard to cope with. And it can also jump up and bite you in the butt, excuse me, when, somebody says something to you. I don't know. I just remember hiding in the grocery store because I didn't want to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of it, right? I think the reason I like talking about grief is because I think to myself, if you were to interpret what you're going through when you're struggling, or you're really sad, or really frustrated with what's going on, if you were to treat yourself as if you were someone who was grieving, might you give yourself a little more grace? And might you give yourself a little more time to be sad about it and be frustrated and allow for some of those emotions to be there? As parents, we're so busy. We have so many things on our to-do list. It's so easy to become those things. And it is about grief. Perhaps it's grieving all the different versions of your life or your child's life that might not make sense anymore, or how we have to put more effort into things because things are more effortful.
Okay.
Yep.
What advice would you give us to guide our children through that grief of the loss of what they thought?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of that is allowing. We don't have, it's better out than in. Allow them that space to grieve and to be sad. And recognize that those emotions are okay. And instilling that confidence in them that together as a family, it's okay to be sad. We can be sad together. You don't have to be sad on your own. You don't have to hide it. Learning to process that is really important. And I will say this, young people tend to process in chunks, especially really younger kids. But you might notice that your kids will be really, really sad and really, really mopey, and then the next minute they're fine. Believe them, because they do. They kind of just go there for a chunk of time, and then they're out, and they're okay. And then they're gonna go back. And that's completely normal. So I think for me, grief is just allowing the space, right? And I talk a lot with young people about how do you want to show up, and sort of knowing your why. It might not be so much what you do, it's why are you doing it and why are you showing up? And what are those things that are worth it? Because there will certainly be things in their life that they will do, and then afterwards they're going to lose a day or two just because they're too exhausted. But if it's worth it and that was something that was really important to them, then okay. And if they can get in touch with that idea of the why they're doing something, then it can be really powerful.
Do you want to answer?
Oh, yeah, there's a question coming through. Can we do anything as parents to help them with feelings of failure to let go of their pre-PSC expectations? Absolutely. I think this is where we come into, like, how do you want to show up to this? And I'm trying to think of the way to describe it, because ultimately it's this idea of, in life's challenges, sometimes what I'll ask kids is, I'm like, say you're turning a corner at school and there's a new kid and somebody is describing you to them. Let me know, tell me, what are those words that if someone said that about you, you would feel like $1 million and be like, oh my gosh, I'm the greatest person on earth if I said that. What are those descriptors? Is it about being funny? Is it about being brave? Is it about being patient? Is it about being dependable? Like, what are those qualities that if someone said that about you, you'd feel great? And then encouraging them to say, okay, well, how did you show up? Did you show up on time and were you dependable? Did you show up as someone who, and dependable, by the way, if you can't show up because you're having a bad day, can look like calling them when you wake up and know, and giving them that heads up. Did you show up in a way that you kind of was lighthearted about it? Did you show up in a way that was brave? Because then the outcome doesn't matter so much. And the focus becomes on how did you show up? How did you walk into that room? Was it with humility? Was it with confidence? Was it with humor? So I think that can be a helpful way to shift the focus on, did I fail? Did I succeed? What's the outcome? And it reshifts the focus on actually the process and what you did moving up to it, right? Because if you showed up to an exam prepared in the way you wanted to be and on time and reliable and all those things, whether it went well or not, you still were successful, because across an entire lifetime, it'll create a more full, rich, and meaningful life. How do we get them to use their accommodations when they don't want to feel different? This one comes up all the time, especially with teenagers. Some of it's asking about what is behind not wanting to be different, because a lot of PSCers can sort of fake good, and you can kind of, I think to some degree that's great, and other times it does kind of work against them. So oftentimes it's asking about, like, well, what would help make it more readily available to use those certain things? So maybe they don't want to write exams in another place, even though 9 times out of 10, what they get out of people is jealousy, because most people would love to write exams in those single kind of spaces where they have privacy. Sometimes it's getting at, what are those things? And are there ways that we can do it that are more acceptable? Can we get creative? Right? And as with lots of teenagers, sometimes it's that they need to have that bad experience or that thing where they're like, ooh, that would have been really nice if I had that accommodation. And some of them need to kind of walk through that and make some of those mistakes and kind of learn on both ends. And as parents, I think sometimes it's about letting them make those mistakes.
Could I ask a question? Totally different.
Yes, absolutely.
Transitioning.
Yeah.
And the just advice about transitioning, because it can be so hard, and for those of you who are going through it, and just that moment of, you get this phone call on Friday afternoon, I'm out of this medicine.
Yeah. So I think, and this comes from the team at Sick Kids, we start already from, like, we have groups for 10 and 11-year-olds where we talk about living with IBD and or PSC, and part of it is just to get them already talking about it and get them talking in doctor's appointments, get them doing it as soon as you can to get them in practice, because if you can have them practice and make that mistake while they still live with you, they can problem solve it through. So the more independent they can be, even while living under your roof, can be really helpful from a preventative standpoint. And whenever possible, letting them answer first any questions and you just filling in gaps. A lot of hepatologists and IBDologists, even who see young adults, will allow parents to be in the room if you ask and if they ask. And I think there's things where people can be a bit more flexible from that regard. But it is certainly a change. Like, there's no, even with all the preparation and even with these new patient navigators that I hope end up being more broadly used, a lot of those things can be mitigated. I will say, though, even in the folks that have had the really wonderful transitions, there still tends to always be that moment when you're in the waiting room in the adult hospital, people around you are older, and you have that, like, just that moment of like, oh, this is different. And I don't know what to expect. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a poor transition or it's not going well. I think it's that moment of acknowledging that it's hard because it's hard. It's not hard because you're doing something wrong. And you're not alone in the fact that this is hard. I think that is very dramatic.
That's our 5-minute warning.
5-minute warning? Okay. So I think around transition, it's that balance of doing what you can ahead of time and also knowing that in the actual moment, to be kind of blindsided and feel a little bit a deer in headlights is to be expected and okay. In terms of the call that you get at Friday, that's where you're like, do we have a 24-hour pharmacy? What can we do? Can we sometimes, because sometimes pharmacies can give you like enough meds to cover you for the weekend. And that might also be one of those lessons that they learn.
Oh,
yeah.
We're ready. Okay.
I think we're good.
Oh, I was going to ask one last question.
Okay.
Can you share a little bit about your iPeer-to-peer program and what you've learned about the value of peer support?
Absolutely. I love peer support because at the end of the day, even though I get to work with young people who live with chronic disease, mostly IBD, I'm still never going to get it. And I think ultimately, peer support is that part of healthcare that there's no other way around getting. Like, to be with people who get it and understand and can actually teach you. So as part of my fellowship, I won't say how long ago that was, I created an iPeer-to-peer program where it trains young adult mentors. So we train them over a weekend, which I do on purpose so that they can get connected. And then what happens is they connect with younger folks. When we first started out, it was just over like Skype calls, but now it uses WhatsApp and texting and all kinds of things. And the entire point is to just be able to connect with someone who gets it and who's a couple steps ahead of you, right? And what I will say is we looked at what did they actually talk about, and this is the part that it really makes my heart burst in many ways, because about a quarter of the time they talked about the impact of the disease on their life. A quarter of the time they talked about coping strategies. And then the rest of the time, they just talked about being humans or teenagers or young people in today's day and age. And I think that's exactly what I would have hoped for, because it's not all about having PSC, it's also about being a young person, right? And I think those are the things that, they're just not going to be able to get from their doctors, their nurses, or allied health professionals. So we've been really fortunate with iPeer-to-peer. It's across multiple disease groups, and oftentimes communities like this are doing it, right? So anytime you can get involved with the PSC community, I'm also a card-carrying member of the fan club. Absolutely get involved, meet others, because they're going to get it. And they're going to be able to listen to you in a way that nobody else can. Maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, so my name is Sandy Van Ostrand. I'm from Richmond, British Columbia. My son has PSC. He was diagnosed when he was 18. It seemed like the highlight of his life at the time because he'd just been drafted by the New York Yankees and everything was just going so well for him. Then he found out he had ulcerative colitis, and then he had PSC, and things sort of turned downhill for him. But fast forward, he has made a wonderful life. Despite the ups and downs, he'll turn 38 this year, so that's 20 years later. And he's married and has a 2-year-old that's wonderful. And, for him, or for me, PSC Partners has been very important to get through this time. And volunteering, which I'm a board member now, and I'm very happy if anyone else wants to help out with fundraising, since I do that. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that has helped me in the journey of PSC, because it helps to do something that feels constructive, to help these, raise money to help these researchers who are doing so much, which is what we've been learning about. Okay, I'm figuring out these things here. I want to say that we appreciate the speakers so much today for taking the time out from their very busy schedules. I just find it amazing the way they use their Saturday to talk to us and help us gain knowledge. And this knowledge just helps us give hope. It gives us hope. So thank you to all of you who asked your questions throughout the day, great questions, and also for your participation in the peer groups. It's really rare that we have an opportunity where we can talk about pediatric PSC together, so I think all of us have really appreciated this time. So what's coming up next? We're hoping that in 2025, we will have what's called a knowledge translation event. And that means, that's what we've been doing today also. It means they're taking the knowledge from the studies that they've been doing, and they're putting it into language that we can sort of understand. Some of us probably can understand it better than others. But we'll be doing that with people of all ages, hopefully in 2025, and then in 2026, we'll be having another pediatric event, so we can look forward to that. And hopefully as many of you as possible will come to the October PSC Partners Conference in Phoenix. And there is some travel ship support available if you would like to have some financial support for that. Just realize all the resources through PSC Partners. So please go to both websites, PSC Partners Canada and PSC Partners, that's .org. And you will find, if you want to have mentorship support, Facebook support groups, Zoom rooms for the teens and for the parents. And you can see there's newsletters. Just make sure you use the, all the information that's there. Please, we would really appreciate you helping to support our mission by volunteering. Raise awareness of PSC. I think it's important, instead of, if I'm talking to someone about David's condition, I don't say that I don't just say he has a liver disease. I make sure I say PSC or primary sclerosing cholangitis, because I think the more that we hear those words, it just raises awareness in the community, because too many of us feel alone and like we're the only people. But if we can start networking, we become more aware that there are many more like us. You can help me and others with fundraising, and please share any ideas that you have. We do have an auction every 2 years, so if anyone wants to talk to me afterwards about helping out with that, please do. And we have coming up right now, in fact, it begins June 1st, throughout June and July, everyone in this room could take part in Walk 83.01. This is a walk that can be done wherever you live. It can be done with whoever you want, and it can be done in whatever way you want. So you might choose to commit to biking 83.01 kilometers, or you might choose to walk, or I know I talked to someone last year who was going to commit to walking 83 blocks because he was having more trouble with distance. But you figure out what you would like to commit to. Maybe as a family, each of you will take, 30, 20 kilometers, whatever you want to commit to doing. And then you ask your friends, families, co-workers to support you. And please don't feel badly about asking them. I know it's tough, but we have letters on the website that can give you ideas of how to ask. And what I've found is people want to help us. Most people like to give donations to someone, and so why not do it to a rare disease that really appreciates the money, and all the money goes to research. It doesn't go to a ton of overhead like in so many of the other bigger organizations. So I'm hoping you'll be creative, you'll figure out ways that you can participate in the walk, and just go online to PSC Partners Canada if you're Canadian. If you're American, make sure you go to the American website so that you get things done the best way, but it's all laid out for you. Yes?
It's okay to just donate to.
Yes, of course. Some of you may not want to actually start a team or get together, but you can always donate. And someone suggested a minimum donation of $83.01 would be wonderful, but obviously any amount would be appreciated. And the 83.01 is because that is, don't know how to say it, it's the code that's used by doctors in the US to say what? ICD code. Okay, so it's the identifier of PSC. So that's why the number is used that is being used. Then we'll keep on going. Thank you to everyone who made this possible, and there are a lot of people at work. We've got to highlight Jessica, and we have to highlight Mary. Two of them did incredible work to make this happen. Then we have our list of all these people who have come together to help out. So thank you to everyone who was involved. And those of you who weren't involved this time can always help out another time. And here are more people. Even the staff at US headquarters was helping us. And there are so many people coming together. Thank you. Oh, more, the AV team. Yes. So thank you, Zoom production, photography, and the venue, the people here who helped out. There's a lot of thank yous to go around. And also incredible contributors, and all these people listed here. And I want to highlight Miriam because they are providing a smoothies bar. So if you go in the back afterwards, there will be a smoothies bar provided by them. And also, they have a table in the back if you have any questions and could just understand more about the research that they are doing. Please do that. I also just want to have a few more reminders. Albert is going to be in the lamps room. If you want to try the virtual reality, he will still be here for that. And also, if you're going to this evening's teen hangout from 7:20 till 9 o'clock, please confirm with Mary or Jessica. And parents are welcome to hang out in a different place if they would like to do that. Anyone who has been awarded a travel ship, please meet Mary at the front of this room near the podium when I finish talking. And this slide we'll put on at the very end when everyone is leaving, just because you might want to copy something down, but these are ways that you can connect with us. And finally, let me close by saying thank you. The biggest thank you is to all of you, the PSC patient and caregiver community. Thank you and safe travels.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. The smoothie bar should be open, and we have the space for another hour for you to hang out, to socialize, to visit with any of us, or to try the virtual reality. So stick around, have a snack, have some smoothies, and thank you so much for being here.